this presentation will demonstrate a little bit about how SBG or SRG is going to look in our classroom here in the social studies portion, as well as what is it, how does it relate to a grade, those kind of things. And so the first thing I'm going to do is just kind of go through what standards-based grading is and what it looks like in my classroom. So a real quick definition, standards-based or reference-based grading sometimes is called proficiency grading. It's a method for teachers to measure how students are doing in meeting specific learning goals for their grade as determined by the state standards. And just this spring, Iowa went ahead and adopted the Iowa Social Studies Standards. And so those are the standards we'll be using, and you can find a copy of those on the students' Google Classroom page. And you'll also see them attached to a lot of the tops of assignments, things like that. So students really know what they're being assessed on and what the standard is we're learning about. Learning goals, sometimes called learning standards, are the academic skills your child should know or be able to do for his or her grade by the end of the school year. Learning targets also can be sometimes used in our classrooms. In my classroom, there will be a set of learning targets, which is more of a small lesson-based or sometimes a couple of days-based learning target versus the essential questions. The essential questions are the overlying. These are the big things you need to know. The learning targets help us get to those big things and knowing how to use them. And that'll be done through a multitude of ways, as we'll talk about here as we go through this presentation. So everybody, of course, wants to know the first thing when they come into a class or a new school year is, how am I going to be graded? What's my grade going to reflect? And the big philosophy here that we've changed to at Baxter is this idea that you shouldn't be graded for your performance. So the idea is we're grading or assessing students on what they truly know. And so there are a couple of ways that works. On the left-hand side here, you can see proficiency scales. And a proficiency scale is simply a way of rating or assessing your students' knowledge. And you can see here it's listed at 1, 2, 3, and 4. We have exceeds standards, meets the standards, approaching standards, and below standards. And this is something that you'll see that kind of shows up with every major assignment, every major assessment that kind of tells us where the students are in terms of that standard. And on the right-hand side here, you can see there's a rubric. Rubrics will help us determine where they are in terms of the proficiency scale. So as you look at this rubric here, there's 20 points possible. With that said, we're going to bounce ahead here in a minute, but with 20 points possible, we're trying to figure out which of the standards fit into these bigger headings. Do they fit into all of them? Does one have one standard and two of them have a different standard? How many standards are truly assessed so that we can give an accurate representation over here in your proficiency scale? So what we're going to talk about in the next slide is how that works. And so with the standard assessment, the idea is that instruction and assessment will directly be tied to those Iowa Social Studies standards I was talking about before. Rubrics linked to standards will be used to assess the student's knowledge and create a traditional grading percentage. So if we go back to this page here, that's where we talk about the typical percentages or your traditional percentages. So let's say your student scored a 3, a 4, a 4, and a 5. So that would be 16 out of 20. So on a traditional grading scale, that would be 80% or a B minus. Now, what we have to understand is, how does that 80% translate from this page to our proficiency scale? And that'll be done in a couple of different ways. So students will receive 2 different scores on an assessment or an assignment. You'll see this traditional percentage-based score. Then you will see the student's proficiency score on specific standards. So like I was saying before, this could assess as many as 3 to 5 standards, these different categories here on this rubric. Then over here, what you would end up getting is, if there's 3 standards, let's say, you would end up with 3 different proficiency scales based on that standard. So what you'll notice is that this percentage score, dependent upon which standard it aligns with, helps create this. So let's just, for the sake of ease, say that these are all assessing the same standard. All right, so we got that 16 out of 20, the student got an 80%. Well, where does that show us over here on the proficiency scale? Well, if we take our translator here, it helps us if we look at 80%, and 80% would be a 2.5. So we would come over here and see that the student partially supports defends their argument of a thesis. They're missing strong support, but they do have some kind of supports there. So what that would mean is that while they had in the traditional sense a B minus, in the proficiency scale they would have a 2.5. So in the grade book, you would see under this assignment, World War II letter, you would see standard 1, then the score, your proficiency skill. So you'd see the 2.5. You wouldn't actually see that 80%. So assessments and assignments in my grade book this year will be no more than 4 points. Now, that you may ask, doesn't that mean that when we average them at the end that they may score lower than what their rubric predictions were, what their rubric scores were? Well, that's true in some cases. In most cases, it's going to iron itself out. And if that is, students also have the right to retake anything they want and rework things using different times in class. So if you take a look here at some of the benefits of standards reference or standards-based grading, I just explained this here, but here's a good solid example. It's more useful to know what your child has met a standard than that she has a B with 84%. Each grade on the report card represents a skill or knowledge standard your child has had the opportunity to learn, so it's a meaningful snapshot of academic achievement. For behavior, report cards often use numbers, plus signs, or minus signs. And as I said before, the benefit of standards-based grading is taking out that behavior. We're no longer interested in gaining extra credit points for bringing markers or Kleenexes, or for turning in something that's done with glitter as opposed to something that's just hand-drawn. So taking out that behavior aspect and really getting to know, do your students know these standards that the state of Iowa is calling as important, is really essential for us to understand. And then it also creates a focus on student learning directly tied to those state learning standards. And what you'll notice is that in social studies, for example, we went from having somewhere between 8 and 12 standards to now close to 52 different things that we're trying to get our students to learn and achieve throughout the myriad of courses that we offer in social studies. And the last one to remember, and I think this is the most important to remember as we're transitioning here, is even top students can earn a 2 or approaching proficiency grade, which can be shocking for families or for students, but it's more important to know why they're struggling with that or where their struggles are. And so what we've seen in the past is students who quote unquote play school really well tend to score A's and B's, but then when they go out to college or to the next step of their life beyond high school, they really struggle because there's no more of that playing school with the bringing in for extra credit and turning in those kind of things. It's truly about what you know. And so the nice thing is, as it says here in the center, on the upside, early low scores aren't averaged into the final grade. So your child is able to rework those, and they can come in and get extra help and have things retaught and reassessed to improve that score. And as you can read, once your child masters the concept, her final grade will show that. And so let's say they got a 2 on that first assignment we were working at, 2.5 as we had mentioned before. If they come in and rework it to a 3, well, then that'll be their grade. Or if they come in and show mastery and get a 4, then they don't have to retake that. So once they hit that 3, which means meets the standard, that means that they're showing mastery of that concept. And you can also use our JMC. Like I said, each assignment will have specific proficiency scores broken down by standard, which will help you get a better understanding of which standards were assessed, how they were assessed, and how your student did on those. So it's important to understand that we're making a big change here with our grading policy, but it's also important to understand that we're truly getting at what students understand, what students do well. And truly this allows for more proficient learners. It also allows for students to be more successful in what they're trying to accomplish.